I used to think that numbers never lied. They were constant, clear, incapable of betrayal, unlike people. My name is Adrian Miller, and I have spent most of my 32 years believing that precision could protect me from chaos. But life inside the Miller family taught me otherwise. Our mansion at Hollow Ridge Estate stood like a marble monument to ambition. My father, Richard Miller, built Militech Infrastructure Group from the dust of small-town contracts into a global empire. He ruled boardrooms the way kings rule courts, with charisma sharp enough to cut. My older brother, Ethan, inherited every ounce of his magnetism, the golden heir who could charm investors with a grin. My mother, Clara, drifted between them, graceful and gentle, the only softness in a house made of stone, and then there was me, the quiet one, the numbers man, the adopted son no one mentioned, but everyone remembered. Even in childhood, I felt like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. At work, I kept my head down as Chief Financial Officer. My job was to keep the money flowing and the spreadsheets clean. But lately, the numbers whispered of danger. Our Harbour Line expansion project, once capped at 40 million, had swollen to twice that size. 5 million had vanished from a partner account in Nashville. When I presented the irregularities at a board meeting, my father brushed me aside with a flick of his wrist. "Not every fluctuation means disaster, Adrian," he said, voice smooth as glass. Ethan laughed, leaning back in his chair. "He's just nervous, Dad. You know how our little accountant gets." The others chuckled. I swallowed my protest and watched the matter dissolve into laughter. That night, I sat alone in my apartment overlooking downtown Atlanta. The glow from my laptop lit the darkness as I traced transaction after transaction. Some led to closed subsidiaries, others to shell accounts with vague names like Kensley Consulting and Harper Logistics. My stomach tightened with every discovery. Something was rotten, and the stench led back to my own family. I confronted Ethan one evening after the office emptied out. The fluorescent lights hummed above us as I held the printouts in my hand. "What is this?" I demanded. He scanned the papers, then smirked. "You really don't get it, do you? The world isn't a ledger you can balance, little brother. Some deals need flexibility." "Flexibility?" I shot back. "You mean fraud?" He laughed softly and clapped my shoulder. "You worry too much. Maybe you're not cut out for this." I left before I said something I'd regret, but inside, fury burned like acid. The next day I went to my father. His office occupied the entire top floor of Militech Tower, a cathedral of glass and steel. He didn't look up when I entered. "Dad," I began carefully, "the Harbour Line expenses are wrong. Someone's moving money off record." His pen paused mid-signature. Then, without meeting my eyes, he said, "Your job is to keep the books in order, not question my decisions." A dismissal. A warning. Both. When I returned home that night, my phone buzzed, a message from my mother. "Dinner tomorrow. Just us. Please come." The following afternoon, sunlight spilled across the marble floors of the Hollow Ridge sitting room. Mother poured tea, her hands trembling slightly. "You and your father have grown so distant," she whispered. "Promise me you'll be careful, Adrian. He's under pressure." "And Ethan?" She trailed off. "I just want the truth," I said. She smiled sadly. "Sometimes the truth breaks more than it mends." Her words stayed with me long after I left. Days later, an invitation arrived. Family dinner to celebrate unity. It sounded rehearsed, too polished. Still, I went. Dusk painted the estate in amber light as I drove up the long, winding road. Laughter drifted from the veranda, the clinking of glasses echoing through open windows. When I stepped out of my car, my phone buzzed again. A new message, no sender listed. "Be careful tonight." They know what you found. My pulse quickened. I scanned the driveway, only servers and chauffeurs. I slipped the phone into my pocket and forced a smile as I entered. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and pretense. Executives mingled with shareholders, their laughter brittle. My father stood at the center, booming and confident. Ethan floated beside him like a shadow of pride. Adrian. Richard exclaimed, arms open. So glad you could make it. Ethan handed me a glass of wine. A toast, he declared, raising his own. To family and forgiveness. I lifted mine mechanically, the taste of bitterness stronger than the Merlot. Moments later, I noticed Ethan slip something into my leather briefcase resting by the buffet. My heart stopped. Pretending not to notice, I excused myself, carrying the case into the hallway. Inside, an envelope lay atop my documents. I tore it open, fake invoices, forged authorizations, and a USB drive labeled offshore transfers. All in my name. They weren't just silencing me, they were framing me. My hands trembled, but my mind sharpened. I tucked the envelope into my jacket, returned to the dining room, and waited for the right moment. When Ethan turned to greet another guest, I quietly slid the envelope into his inner pocket. Minutes later, the double doors burst open. Uniformed officers and a suited investigator from the Georgia Financial Bureau strode in. Gasps rippled through the crowd. We've received credible evidence of embezzlement at Militech, the lead officer announced. Adrian Miller, you're accused of financial misconduct. All eyes turned to me. My father's expression was unreadable. Ethan looked almost triumphant. I stood calmly. You can search me. I have nothing to hide. They searched my briefcase, my jacket, my laptop, nothing. Then, steadying my voice, I said, maybe you should check my brother. Ethan froze. The officer reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope. Silence fell like a hammer. Ethan's face drained of color. This isn't mine. Someone planted it. The investigator flipped through the papers. These are the same documents submitted in the anonymous tip. Mr. Miller, you'll need to come with us. The guests murmured, the illusion of perfection shattering in a chorus of whispers. My father's eyes burned into me, fury and disbelief tangled together. When the officers led Ethan away, I exhaled for the first time all night. The mask had cracked. The next morning, the headlines screamed scandal. An emergency board meeting convened in Militech's high-rise conference room. My father, pale and tight-lipped, called it a misunderstanding, but the shareholders weren't fooled. The audit traced multiple irregular transactions to Ethan's credentials. Richard and Ethan were suspended indefinitely. The board appointed me acting director of finance until the investigation concluded. That evening, my father stormed into my office. You think you've won, he hissed. You ungrateful mistake, we took you in, and this is how you repay us. The word mistake hit harder than any blow. Suddenly every cold glance, every half-smile, every unspoken distance made sense. Later that night, unable to rest, I drove back to the mansion. The corridors were dark, the house hollow without its noise. In my father's locked drawer, I found a faded envelope labeled Adoption Records Private. Inside lay my birth certificate. My mother's name read Isabella Hart. No father listed. A handwritten note rested beneath it, adoption completed. Never mention this. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the room was filled with an eerie calm, the kind that follows a storm, but warns of another one brewing. The sunlight streamed in through the sheer curtains, painting soft gold on the walls, but even that warmth couldn't thaw the cold pit in my chest. The letter still lay where I had left it the night before, its words seared into my mind. Marcus, you are not the rightful heir. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, the pride in his eyes the day he told me that Hale and Sons would one day be mine. That promise had been the cornerstone of my life. And now, it seemed like a cruel illusion. I drove to the Hale estate in Marietta that morning, the house I'd grown up in, the one that smelled faintly of cedar and oil from my father's workshop. Every memory in that place was threaded with his presence, his laughter echoing faintly in the corridors of my mind. Yet as I walked in, it felt foreign, as though I were trespassing in my own past. Victoria was already there, of course. My father's second wife. She sat at the long mahogany table in the dining room, dressed immaculately in a black silk robe, sipping her coffee with an elegance that bordered on theatrical. "Marcus," she greeted, her tone smooth as glass. "I didn't expect you this early. I assume you've read the letter." I clenched my jaw. I did. Care to explain why my fathers will suddenly name someone else? She smiled, the kind of smile that made my blood boil. "Ah, so direct. I always admired that about you. Unfortunately, your father made adjustments to his estate before he passed. You'll find that everything was done within the law." "Within your manipulation, you mean," I snapped. "He wasn't well in those last months, and you..." "Careful," she interrupted softly, her eyes glinting. "You wouldn't want to accuse a grieving widow of coercion without proof." Her voice dripped with false sympathy, but her eyes were cold, calculating. I'd known for years that she despised me, though she'd hidden it behind smiles and sweet tea. Still, I never imagined she'd go this far. I slammed the folder she'd left open on the table. "Who is this other heir?" "There's no one else in our family." Her silence stretched, deliberate. Then she rose and walked toward the window, gazing out over the manicured lawns. "You'll find out soon enough. But perhaps it's time you learned that your father had other priorities before you came along." The implication hit like a hammer. "You're saying he had another child?" She turned, her expression unreadable. "I'm saying that you should stop clinging to what isn't yours. The company, the estate, they belong to the rightful bloodline." I stormed out before she could say another word. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. Every part of me wanted to believe she was lying, that this was just another of her cruel games. But something in her tone told me otherwise. I spent the next 2 days drowning in records, files, anything that might hold a clue. My father had been meticulous about documentation, contracts, property transfers, personal notes. But the deeper I dug, the more inconsistencies I found. Bank statements showed transfers to an account I didn't recognize. Receipts for private trips to Savannah. Letters addressed only with initials, L. H. Then came the photograph. It was tucked inside an old ledger, faded with time. My father stood beside a woman I didn't know. She was young, maybe in her 30s, with auburn hair and a soft smile. In her arms was a baby, swaddled in a white blanket. On the back, in my father's handwriting, were the words, "For my son, Lucas." I sat there for a long time, the air sucked out of the room. Lucas. My half-brother. The rightful heir. That night, I drove to Savannah. The address listed in one of the old bank documents led to a small coastal house, weather-beaten but neat. The porch light flickered faintly in the mist. I knocked once. The door opened, and a young man stood before me, mid-20s, tall, with the same hazel eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. The resemblance was undeniable. He froze when he saw me. "You're Marcus Hale," he said quietly, "and you're Lucas." He nodded, his expression wary. "She told me you might come." "Victoria." He hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled of sea salt and machine oil, familiar scents that made my throat tighten. Inside, on the mantel, was a framed photograph of my father and Lucas, smiling together. "She found me after your father died," Lucas said as I stared at the picture. Said he wanted me to know who he was. Said he'd planned to bring me into the business, but didn't get the chance. She's lying, I said automatically, though even I wasn't sure anymore. My father would never have hidden you. He did, Lucas replied softly. He visited sometimes, sent money, but he made my mother promise to keep me out of sight. He said he didn't want to destroy his family. The words sliced deeper than I expected. I wanted to hate him, this stranger, who had suddenly claimed everything I'd built my life around, but looking into his eyes, I couldn't. He wasn't the enemy. He was as much a victim of my father's secrecy as I was. I don't want your inheritance, he said after a long silence. But I do want to know the truth. So did I. In the weeks that followed, we dug together, through old correspondence, legal records, even my father's personal journals. Slowly, a picture emerged of a man torn between two lives. He had loved Lucas's mother before meeting mine, but their relationship had ended under pressure from his family. When she had his child, he had tried to provide in secret, balancing guilt and duty until it consumed him. By the time he married my mother, the lie had already rooted itself too deeply to undo. And when Victoria came along, she found that secret, and used it. One evening, as Lucas and I sat on the porch watching the tide roll in, he turned to me and said, "You know, she doesn't care about either of us. She just wants control." I nodded. Then we take it back. We began to plan, quietly, carefully. Victoria had manipulated the will, but if we could prove her involvement, everything she'd stolen would crumble. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, I felt something other than anger. I felt purpose, because this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about truth, the kind that burns away everything false until only what's real remains, and for the first time in years, I wasn't alone in facing it.